I would love to begin with the moment you first heard about the idea of Imago. What was your journey leading up to that moment? Where were you in your personal and professional life then? And what was the core idea of Imago at its early inception?
That's a very complex question because Imago was founded before it was founded. Imago was actually conceived at in a park near Georgetown. Isabel and I were on a walk, and at the time I was working as her coach at the World Bank, and it was basically a question about what would be the ideal state of development. And she began to talk about next generation and people who were closest to the experience and getting people out of the middle and really getting closer to the reality of what the poorest of the poor experienced, and then how to then bring that to a point where it could be all scaled up. And so that's where Imago actually began. The real founding is that there was a meeting here in San Diego where I invited Michael and Isabel to come to speak to my classes in organizational development, where they had a project and where they actually had to figure out how to do something. I figured it would be useful if they talked to people who actually did things. And so, but in that time, what we did is we began to think about then what would something like this be? And Isabel had this idea of creating something upon her retirement that would look like what Imago has become. And so that was the actual founding of Imago. And there were 6 or 8 of us sat around a table, lots of stuff on the wall. And then that's how it got conceived. And then Isabel said, and you will be the co-founder. And I thought I was just facilitating the meeting. And I said, well, I don't know about all of that. And the next thing I know is that this thing got incorporated and I was the co-founder. So there you have it. But it really is this vision and beautiful thing that Isabel Guerrero developed. And Michael was strongly there from the very beginning. And then the 3 of us as most people will know, worked closely with SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. And that's where it really began to find its wings.
That's it's beautiful to hear. It's always inspirational. So I want to know from you, what is it about Imago that struck you as different from what you had seen in international development before? And what are the core values you think define Imago?
Those are 2 very different questions. So let me approach each as one. In terms of being very different, I think the major part of it is that most of my experience was coaching at the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and also doing training at the International Monetary Fund. So all of those places, there was so much emphasis on the governmental relationships, and there was really this top-down hierarchy. And I would say quite honestly, an imposition of all kinds of conditionalities on the people that were being supported. There's also an implicit neo-colonialism, savior syndrome part of this process. And so those kinds of things were embedded in the nature and the DNA of how the humanitarian sector is actually set up. And so one of the things that was different about Imago from the very beginning was a sort of an understanding of that's how it's set up. And then how do you do it differently? Now, what we discovered very soon upon starting this is that because we didn't look like how funders thought about these things, how the multilaterals thought about these things, or how any of the bilateral organizations in terms of key performance indicators and metrics and all of those kinds of things, that we couldn't quite communicate what it is that we were trying to do. That was challenging. That was really challenging. And for me personally, it's very frustrating because I was this university professor, and there was this thing that we were trying to create as Imago, and the amount of energy and labor that it was going to take to get this thing off the ground. Oh, that was a real test. And it was a source of great frustration because there's no revenue. This was really basically built off of the donations of Michael and Isabel to it, because I was not a full-time bank person. I was a consultant to the bank, so I didn't have the benefit of that. So I had to work. And so it was something that I believed in, but it's how do you make this come alive? And so the real challenge was to figure out a way to communicate what it is that we were doing so that people could see it and so that people could trust it, and that we literally represented a foot in the world of the World Bank and other development spaces. And we sort of knew that language, but we were trying to invite that world to see that there was another way. And we didn't want to use like World Bank contracts and things of that sort to start us off. And we didn't want to do requests for proposals and get into that. We wanted to work with the people who were the poorest of the poor and figure out how to help them scale up. And that was the challenge. And that was the biggest difficulty. Now, we can talk about the core values. So you want to talk about that as well? Yeah, okay. So the core values from the beginning was how do you co-create? How do you actually co-create with your partners? They're not your clients in the sense of that, and they're not these people you're trying to save. These are people who are living this on a daily basis, and they have knowledge and understanding of that. They just don't have the capital often, and they don't have certain systems in place to be able to do that. So how do you do this in an authentic language of co-creation? That was first. The whole idea of this was scaling up, and the concept of missing middle, that was more Michael and Isabel's province. So my province was much more of then, how do you then create a dialogic space? And dialogic meaning not back and forth, but dialogic, creating a language together so that we are actually speaking to each other, that we're creating something together in the language that we're using. So the dialogic piece of it was important. And then the third part, which we came to later, is then how do you bring expertise without imposition? So we recognized that we had a certain level of expertise that we could offer, but we had to do it without attachment, without an imposition, and without really, quite honestly, any kind of necessarily financial benefit, especially at the beginning, for doing what we were doing. So that was really hard. And we wanted to stay there. And then we developed this other principle that once we were able to establish ourselves, if this were to ever happen in the first years, that was questionable. Could we then create a situation where, not like in a lot of Western and corporate and even humanitarian sector spaces, where the person who is at the beginning of their career and the person who is the top, that there would be no more than 7 or 8 times that amount when we use that borrowing from Sewa. And then could we live by that as an organization? That was a real question. And so those were some of the elements in terms of the values. And then there were other things that went underneath that I can talk about in terms of the sort of orientation or theoretical aspect of it that we talked about. But I'll stop there for now.
Oh yeah, this is great. It really, I feel like, there's a lot of values that underpin what Imago does. So this is useful. But fast forwarding to today, what do you think it is about Imago's approach and how we do things that sets us apart?
Okay, good. Yeah, and that's wonderful because I wanted to segue into that. So again, let me speak to the fact that the decades of experience that Michael and Isabel bring to this, from being in the positions as economists at the World Bank, and Isabel in particular being the vice president of the South Asia region. And those kinds of experiences are absolutely invaluable in terms of understanding the complexities of what is needed in the developmental sector from the positions where they talked directly to heads of state, where they were really central to a lot of policy level decisions, and where they were working with literally billions of dollars of budget. Okay, so they have that perspective, but they also witnessed directly the smallest operations, and they recognized in those smaller operations that something was happening. Okay, so you have the expertise in terms of macroeconomics. They represent that. But then there are other parts that are Imago, and that's the key. The whole notion of an Imago, the image, to bring something forward, and the whole metaphor of the caterpillar that is, moving to that space before it really takes flight. That whole process is the beautiful imagery and metaphor, but the metaphor speaks to other pieces. It's the notion that how do we deal with in development that if you cut the cocoon of a butterfly, it never develops its wings. It needs that struggle to be able to do that. So how do you accompany as opposed to step in and think you're doing something helpful, but may actually be doing something that deprives the opportunity to really take flight yourself. So that's another piece of it. But another real important part, and this is the part that I think I want to emphasize, is that we use a psychodynamic archetypal understanding of organizations. And we take a systemic understanding where we're looking at the interrelationship or the integral nature of what is going on here in a small organization and how it fits into a larger global context. You can think in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals as sort of like the macro global level of that. But if we're working with an organization, let us say, that is doing something in terms of trying to figure out how to help vendors get things to the market, it's the same work, but it's at the smaller scale. And we know what the largest scale looks like. Now, what is difficult is that there are issues of power, there are issues of history and colonial legacy. There are issues of race and gender and orientation. All of these things are in this, and they're economic caste-like elements that are part of this that are in these conversations. We try to have those conversations. We try to create the conditions where we can talk about how those parts, where there's exclusion, where there's power, where those kinds of things have an impact on how much I feel like when I am picking the trash so that it can go to recycle, how much that is in that moment. What we found is that we were able to create situations of trust in us in those conversations. And by having the trust, then you can talk about what's going on in your family, what's going on in your village, what's going on in your relationship with your brother or sister in the organization, because those are the things that tend to be hidden And behind that veil is often the thing that is intruding on the capacity to be able to even think about scaling up. We were able to invite people to tell those stories and to literally show us by using models, actually little Lego toys, to be able to actually see and to talk about those things that were undiscussable. We even, before it was possible to do this on the internet, we used to bring clickers into meetings with Sewa. And then the women would be able to see on the screen right in front of them by voting with these little clickers where the tensions were in their own organizations. And then we could have a conversation. And that was the beautiful part. So this sort of psychodynamic understanding means that things that people have defenses about, things that people have in terms of where they want to lead as a sovereign, or where they're torn apart by conflict because there's so much warrior energy, or where there was this innocence, or where there were things that were creating out of nothing. All of those things, we tried to work with all of that, and we could actually help people see where they were and have conversations they never had before. And from there, then we could create the structures, and then we could create the systems, and then we could help people develop what you would call a strategic plan. But we would also work towards creating accountability structures. And then our job was to accompany these processes, not to be the ones to do them, but to accompany these processes so the capacity would be developed with our partners. And that's those are things that set us apart.
Yeah, that's a beautifully transformative process that I think, you described very well. So I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned trust, and like, how does Imago build relationships with organizations? How do you build this trust, especially because you work with many of them for a long period of time? Mm-hmm. And how is that different from other organizations? And what is the process of building trust?
Well, if we go from the beginning, when we, the Sewa example, but it's also true with Poverty Stoplight, and it's also true with other places, TRI in India. These are early examples where we stayed. A lot of organizations would come and they would offer their services for a couple months to a Sewa. And then they would be able to put on their website, worked with Sewa. But then they would go. And then they would do a beautiful report that Sewa would say, "Thank you very much." It would sit on their shelf. I think the difference is that we went summer after summer after summer with virtually no compensation. And what was important is that we were learning together. We were learning what worked, what didn't work, quite honestly. We had some failures, and we also used that in the sort of nimble sort of, I guess you would say, human-centered design thinking, but that isn't the important part. The important thing is that even if it were not about human-centered design thinking, it was about the ability to learn from what we were doing and then use that learning to then create the next part. Then the next thing that I think we were able to do really successfully, because of the number of interns that we've gotten from Harvard, who we now call fellows, and then also Columbia, places like that, who are interested in a different kind of way, they would come in and then they would literally be able to be embedded in these organizations before the pandemic and do tremendously important work. And when people would then see, the organizations would see what they got at the end, it reflected the organization. It reflected their values. It reflected their needs. And it also had utility. So this long-term accompaniment, this use of their language, and then the value added, all of those pieces give you trust. There's also a subtlety, is that we actually listen. There was one meeting, really important one, where one of our client systems knew that they needed to go to more of a computer-based, internet-based system of tracking their membership. They knew that. And they'd had two other organizations come in, and one organization, charged them a lot of money. They got a system and they never used it. And so we said, you need to do this. And they said, thank you very much. But the way they said, thank you very much at the meeting was like, no, here you are. You're just like everybody else. But we were able to read that. And then they were able to tell us how much they've been burnt by other organizations, how they'd come in, use their resources, which were so minimal as it was, and then they ended up with something that they couldn't use. And then 3 years later, we were still with them. And now that membership system is in place. Now it can be used. And now they're in a position to work better with the government because of that. They can really say, this is the number of members that we have. And, this is the average age, and things that they would have never been able to do before. So those things build trust. And we were able to help a business go from a place of it should have been able to scale, but it couldn't. But we were able to use the language, the values, and the beautiful thinking of the members themselves. And then they were able to bring it to scale. And then we were able to now move that all the way to the government looking at, okay, you're doing something here. So it's staying there long enough to really see, because if you do a key performance indicator over 6 months, you're not necessarily going to see something, but over a 3 to 5 year sweep, you begin to see it. You begin to see it. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, trust is so hard to, build over time. So yeah, that was very useful. So I have a question here on on workshops. So how a lot of what Imago does is hold these workshops and engage with the client, and it's one of the methods you use to, I guess, build trust, also uncover tensions. So I wanted to learn from you, and I know you've done a lot of workshopping. What makes an Imago workshop unique, and how do you use it for all the things you were talking about, from building trust to engaging with the client and listening?
Well, you've been long enough with us now that you know that our workshops are a little bit different. Let's talk about just the style of the workshops. The content is actually somewhat secondary, because the content looks like any other consulting firm or training organization. That's not so much what's different. We don't even start a meeting amongst ourselves without doing a check-in. In other words, we recognize that people are coming to this session with whatever they're carrying with them. And the check-in is an opportunity to mark the space between whatever was going on before to be able to enter the space of this. And we do one methodology that's called One Breath, and we do an extended version of the One Breath exercise, which allows you to really just move this space of a workshop into its own sacredness. And I use that word advisedly, but that's really what we mean, is that we're trying to create a sacred space of work together that allows everybody's voice equitably to enter the space. And then it also is then at the end of that one breath time is to say, what do we say? Which then models that we're trying to listen to each other from the very beginning. And that way of starting our workshops signals that we're in a different kind of space. Another part which we developed in the last couple years is that we don't just put up a set of guidelines for how we're going to run this meeting. we invite those we work with to develop their own norms and to really do it at a profound level of what do they need to trust that this moment is going to be there. And it goes back to the trust question. And this invitation then signals again, okay, this isn't a normal meeting. This is one where we're operating from a deep sense of what is sacred, what is private about me, what I need to feel like this is a safe enough space for me, and then for us to reach consensus collectively. So this movement from the individual to the collective, moving from the individual to the collective and holding them is a part of it. Then the next part is that before we do a workshop, we do interviews of the people we're going to work with. Now, a lot of organizations do that, but then, as you've seen in our meetings, then we go around and around what things we have, available as methodologies. But then we custom design those methodologies based on what we've heard to figure out what this particular partner needs. And then we design it accordingly. And we assure that it isn't simply a lot of information that we're giving, but it in itself is the workshops are an ongoing sense of inquiry. They continue to ask the question, ask the question, ask the question. We often start with a central inquiry. And if we're beginning with an organization, then we do a thing around tensions. And we don't mean tensions like fight, but we talk about the places and spaces where an organization has, we have different views of this. And we think that that's interesting. And we present it as, isn't that interesting? You disagree on this? And people go, and then we say, so let's talk about what are those things? And by doing it as something that you're looking at, as opposed to putting people right at each other, you can talk about the difference collectively, as opposed to getting into these debate situations, which then just beats people down. And then the other part is that whatever we're being invited to consider, then a lot of it is then in breakout groups or in various models that we have, everything from role playing to system mapping, just to name a few. We then are able to see with the people that we're working with what it is that they see. And again, we don't try to impose, we try to listen and we hear. And then we close it by making sure that there are at least one or two things that people are going to take forward. If it's a single engagement, then we try to create it right there. If it's an ongoing engagement, then what we try to do is build something that is sufficient for now, accountability within that for now, and then we take responsibility for documenting that piece along with them. And so that we can provide the next time, this is where we were, so that we're literally building. The whole notion of a sort of an iterative design process is something that we truly believe in. And that from an iterative design space, that it's an emergent process. And that what we're working on right now may not even be what we work on, but we want to build to that next place. And most importantly, what we're trying to do is build the capacity within the organization to do exactly what we've done with them themselves. So that's a short version of the workshops.